Welcome, friends, to this episode of the Bahçes Histories of Cyprus. The Bahçes is an independent public history project. Each month, our editors bring fresh and exciting work from all around the world on the history, the people, the culture of Cyprus. If you would like to support our work, you can or join our team. We're always on the lookout for new collaborators. You can access our website at historiesofbahçes.org or find us on Facebook and Instagram. We invite you to share your questions, comments, concerns throughout the duration of the episode using the chat function. We remind you to be respectful of others in the room. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce you to our host for this afternoon, Nur Çetiner. Nur?
Thank you, Loisos. Welcome to this episode of Bahçes, History of Cyprus. My name is Nur Çetiner, and today I'm joined by Andrekos Varnava, who is a professor in British Imperial and Colonial History at Flinders University and Honorary Professor at the Monfort University. He has written and lectured on British and European history with special attention paid to both British and Ottoman empires and their influence on the Middle East. And Varnava has published several papers, monographs, edited volumes, and chapters. He is one of the leading historians on the history of Cyprus during the British colonial period. His research generally falls under the umbrella of history of colonialism, war, and migration. Today, we are not going to talk about migration, but maybe I hope we will talk about it in another webinar. And today we are going to talk about Cypriots under the British administration, and we will focus on the people of the islands, and their lives, their identity construction process. And first of all, I would like to thank Andrekos Varnava very much for attending our webinar all the way from Australia, despite the time differences. So
and let me also thank you. Thank you also for having me. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Varnava. Hi and welcome to you. As I said, we will focus on the Cypriots, but before passing to Cypriots, I will ask the classical question to you. Can you elaborate the importance of Cyprus for the British colonial administration, or was the island important for the British?
Well, when they occupied Cyprus way back in 1878, they had hoped that it would be important to them. They had particularly hoped that it would be strategically important. They had hoped that they would have a large garrison in the island, and they hoped that they would have a naval base. And their plan was that in the event of, let's say, troubles once again between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, that they could use their troops from Cyprus to quickly go and help the Ottomans, which they had actually undertaken to do in the agreements that had seen the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, cede the right to occupy and administer Cyprus to the British. However, Cyprus very quickly, as soon as they got there, to them was pretty bad. I mean, there were no roads, there was stifling heat. They began to become quite unwell, the troops. We know next to nothing about the Indian troops that were there. This was the first time that Indian troops, or let's say troops from the subcontinent, had been taken to Europe. They were in Cyprus. We don't know a great deal about them, but we do know that the British troops suffered from malaria and other ailments. And there were many other reasons why they realized that maybe this wasn't such a good decision after all. They hadn't done a great deal of research. Nobody had visited there to give an assessment of the island. The harbor was, they had hoped that Famagusta Harbor would be their naval base, but it was in no state to be a naval base. It was clogged up, full of sand. There were many reasons why they very quickly began to pull away from what they had thought Cyprus would be, even to the point where they announced early in 1879 that they wouldn't go ahead with redeveloping Famagusta Harbour, even though they did have a study done on it, and it wouldn't have cost a great deal as a first step, at least, to dredge the harbour and do some minor works there as a first step. But they decided that instead that they wouldn't provide any imperial funds to redevelop Cyprus. During the next period, of course, the Beaconsfield government falls in 1880, and then the Gladstone government comes to power, transfers Cyprus from the Foreign Office's responsibility to the Colonial Office, and thereafter Cyprus more or less is treated like any other colony, even though it still was, sovereignty still was with the Ottoman Empire until 1914. And thereafter, Cyprus, basically, they use local funds primarily for works. They developed, for example, a little bit Larnaca, a little bit Limassol harbors, Kirinya Harbour. They built excellent road infrastructure. That was probably their most significant public works that they did during this early period. And then when Joseph Chamberlain becomes Colonial Secretary in the mid-1890s, that's when there is some investment. However, it was a loan. It wasn't merely given over. The Cypriots had to repay that loan. And that's when Famagusta Harbour was redeveloped. However, it sort of goes back to the first study of 1878-79. It was really just an initial first step. It wasn't a naval base when they redeveloped it. It was basically for it to become a small, really, commercial harbour. And they also built reservoirs at that time, and also the train. And yeah, the importance of Cyprus was really, as I say in my first book, which was an adaptation, if you like, of my Ph.D, British Imperialism in Cyprus. I call it the inconsequential possession. I mean, it's important to note here that the vast majority of the British Empire, was not India. It wasn't the jewel in the crown. I mean, they were by and large, these places were inconsequential. We can talk about other places. Obviously, this isn't the place to do that. But yeah, it was just another part of the British Empire.
Thank you. And then what was the reaction of the islanders to the new rule? For example, in the classical historiography, many works defend that Archbishop Serafinos welcomed the British with the desire of enosis, but you show that it's not valid. And can you explain this? What did the Archbishop expect from the new rule?
Okay, yeah. Well, basically, let me just say that I want to pay tribute here to Rolandos Katsounis, because he actually, before me, he showed that Sophronius never said anything in support of enosis when the British arrived. And one of the pieces of evidence that Rolandos used, which I think is a very important piece of evidence, were the criticisms of Cypriots who had settled in Egypt, and they had someone in Cyprus who was there at the arrival of the British, and he then was very critical of the fact that nobody stated to the British that Cypriots want to unite with Greece. So that was a very telling piece of evidence that Rolandos put forward. I merely built upon that by finding, and it wasn't actually, somebody told me where this was, and it was, I'm happy to say, Rita Severis told me where the speech was that Sophronius gave to Sir Garnet Wolseley upon his arrival. From memory, in some obscure archive in Canada. So the speech itself was in French, the language, I suppose, of diplomacy. And Sophronius was an educated archbishop. He'd been educated both in the Ottoman Empire and in Greece, obviously in theology. He'd become archbishop in 1865. So he was archbishop for 35 years. And as you say, there is this myth of the welcome. What's interesting, however, is at some point in time, so that the myth of Sophronius's welcome is the original sort of myth early on in the very early 1900s, soon after he dies in 1900. So he was archbishop for 35 years. We then begin with the Sophronius myth that he said all of this. Of course, he's dead now, so he can't rise up and say, guys, I never said this, right? And here's my speech. He probably gave it to some British guy, and that's how it ended up in Canada. But he never said anything of the sort. His primary expectation, or not demand, but sort of expectation, was that the British would bring equality before the law, because of the unequal nature of that institution, or the judiciary in Ottoman times. That was his sort of main expectation, and that they would improve the economic situation as well.
Okay, thank you. And speaking of Archbishop Sophronius, can you talk a little bit about him? You have an excellent book chapter, and you describe him as the last of the old and the first of the new. Can you elaborate on?
You're referring to the book chapter in this book, which I did with Mikhail from the University of Cyprus. He's in the Turkish Studies department. Unusual, but I might just read the last paragraph here, because it sort of speaks to what you said, and I can't probably say it any better than what I said here. Sophronius was undoubtedly the last of the old ethnarchs and the first of the new. He was the last of the old because he wanted to continue the practice of church co-option by the state as practiced under the Ottomans, which had given the church a privileged political and socio-economic position. Now, by that, I should stop and explain that under the Ottomans, the church was incredibly powerful. It begins really in the 18th century and possibly even before then, but there's very limited work on the 17th century. But from the 18th century, we begin to see this. The archbishops were so powerful, they could remove a governor if it all aligned right, they could. And before the events of 1821, it happened several times. Often they would, side with the government against the peasant population, which consisted of both Muslims and Christians. Of course, we have 1821. I've just written a chapter about 1821 in a new book. You probably can see it here. This one, with Yanni Cartledge, which elaborates further from this book, where I talk about those events and how basically the executions that took place were in large part a result of the fact that the archbishop.
You're mute. It's okay.
Am I back?
Yes.
So what I was saying is that the new chapter in this book builds upon this early sort of snippet, in that, going back to that book from 2009, in which I say that the executions in 1821 were, at least in some part, a result of a governor who was upset at the power of the archbishop and the bishops in the island. And Sophronius basically wanted to continue that relationship, the role that the church had as part of the administration, and repeatedly, for many years, in fact, would go back to the British. And one of his main complaints was that the church could no longer collect canonical dues, funds that they had been allowed to collect under the Ottomans, and he would refer to the Berat that he had the authority to do it, but he couldn't do it anymore. So that's what I mean when I say the privileged position and co-option. He was also the last of the old because he did not believe in ethnic nationalism, or specifically Greek nationalism, or indeed in enosis, unless the British were to abandon the island. So whenever later on, not during the early years, but later on, when there were, for example, rumors that the British would abandon the island because they were going to reduce the size of the garrison, there were rumors spreading that they would leave the island, and Sophronius, under pressure, presumably as well, although I don't know that for sure, but he wrote and he said, if you are going to abandon the island, we'd like us to be united to Greece. But he made it clear that he said, if you're going to abandon the island. Now, he was the first of the new because he saw the church as a modernizing agent, urging the British to introduce equality in the judicial system and supporting representative institutions and mass education. Yet he wasn't modern enough. And this is one of the points that I make in that chapter that you referred to, because he's a neglected figure. Because at some point in time, this myth changes to, it wasn't Sophronius who said it, but it had been the Bishop of Gideon who had said it, because they worked out that he was the one who was the nationalistic one out of the two. So Sophronius, even though he's archbishop for 35 years, is a rather forgotten figure in Cyprus. But I felt, I worked a lot on Sophronius, that he was a far more complicated ethnarch that gave me, how can I put it? Not inspiration so much, but the interest to keep going in trying to understand him. I think one thing I forgot to mention was this letter he sends to the Jerusalem Theological School, where he says, my country is Cyprus and I'm an Orthodox Christian of the Eastern dogma. It's quite a telling thing. I think he always remained with that idea, with that view, this, if you like, Romeosini idea, and just couldn't understand nationalism. He definitely, in his early years, definitely in the 1870s and early 80s, he's thinking that this is contrary to Christianity, even, which is where I think it must have been in here as well, where I talk about it in that chapter.
Okay. But you mentioned that he wasn't a nationalist, but why he chose Greece instead of Ottoman? If the British left from the island, he chose enosis. Why he didn't want to go back to the Ottoman? Because he had a powerful position during the Ottoman era.
Yes, that is true. That's a question that I wondered, but I suppose I didn't fully contemplate. I think it's primarily because of the fact that by the time that he's saying that he's come to that view, he is trying to allow, he's thinking that Cyprus should, because of the majority Christian population, be joined to Greece if the British leave. So his preference is for the British to stay, even though they haven't co-opted the church, and he's upset about that. But he also has fallen out of favor with the Ottomans. Now, in the 1870s, I think in 1872 maybe, or 1871, he went to Constantinople, to Istanbul on a mission, and he achieved, I think, what the intention was, to help relieve the situation in Cyprus. But at some point, when the ecumenical patriarch becomes vacant, his name is put forward as a candidate. I've never been able to properly investigate this, but I do know that Sophronius's name was removed, so to speak, by the Ottoman authorities. So something has also happened there, and he's probably picked up on that, that he had lost favor with the Ottoman authorities. And he definitely welcomed the British in 1878. He did believe that the British would bring, so to speak, and being very generalistic, better times. You see in the images that they're welcomed, you know, with the raising of the British flag in front of the cathedral there. They've even put the, you know, in the front cover of the book, right? They've even put the throne that's inside, that's usually reserved for an archbishop or a bishop, outside for the British to sit on. Of course, they don't sit on it, but that's beside the point. They've gone out of their way to create this elaborate ceremony in which they're blessing the British flag. There's more to be. There's probably more to be done about Sophronius and what happened, and his name was struck from the potential list of ecumenical patriarch candidates.
Okay, thank you. And so after the death of Sophronius, the struggle between nationalists and conservatives began for electing the new archbishop. What was the role of ordinary Cypriots in this struggle, or did ordinary Cypriots play a role in the struggle between the nationalists and the conservatives?
Well, they did to some extent, and I think Rebecca Bryant has written about some of this. Basically, as you know, there is a division between those supporting the Bishop of Gerinia, who to some extent, although that does change, supporting the old Sophronius line, but I think it's sort of changed to, you know, soft enosis, so to speak. Enosis when the British want to give it to us. And the Kitiaki, who are far more fanatical, far more nationalistic, far more eager to see Cyprus united to Greece. And to some extent, in order, you know, their authority rests upon the Legislative Council, and so they want to be there in the council to put forward this the idea of enosis. So people voting for them becomes important, but also they need people to be going around and you know, telling the British whenever there's an opportunity. So often during this period, but also after this period, up until the First World War, you know, when British officials, High Commissioner or someone else, was visiting a town and they had given notice that they would be visiting the town, oh, the Greek flags would come out and all of that would happen. But there's also evidence that when the High Commissioner would deviate from his program and went to another place, there'd be nothing there. There'd be no Greek flags there. There'd be no reception and speech about, you know, enosis or anything like that. So there was this element that of the British believing that it was to some extent manufactured or artificial or controlled by those who believed it was in their interests to support and prosecute the idea of enosis.
Okay, I am also wondering about the influence of newspapers on the island. Right after the British came to the island, the first newspaper was established by the Greek Cypriot Theodoros Constantinos. What was the importance of newspapers in spreading national ideas? Did newspapers have any significance for the lives of ordinary Cypriots?
Well, as time went on, it certainly did. However, even up till World War I, a substantial proportion of the population was illiterate. Obviously, they would still be able to appreciate what was in the newspapers if they'd gone down to the coffee house and there were inevitably there'd be the teacher there or someone there who could read to them what was in the newspapers and probably would read it out aloud. In the early years, I'm not so sure about how strong the influence of the newspapers would have been, but they're certainly around. They're sort of a bit up and down. You know, newspapers start up and then they shut down, and then others start up. So there's a little bit of turnover during those early years. But we do begin to see more consistency at sort of the turn of the century. And by that point in time, we do begin to see a greater, I think that they're starting to have some influence. However, we also need to remember that, you know, if we think of Surridge's report from, 1930, based upon, his investigations in the late 20s, and Surridge had been in Cyprus since World War I. So when I did the other book on the muleteers, he came up and I saw his name and I thought, he's been there for a while. So when he comes to do that report, he's already quite knowledgeable about Cyprus. But some of the telling things that he says, and one of them that I remember very clearly is that 80% of the population was either on or below the subsistence line, which is telling you something, that their priority is to actually feed their families, feed themselves and their families. So I think that even up until the 20s, the vast majority of the population are peasants and really, small holders. They don't own a lot of land, and that's their priority.
Yes.
I mean, I think to some extent their world was separate from the world of the politicians to some extent. That they're connected in some ways, particularly because many of the politicians were money lenders and so forth and so on. However, there is, at the end of the day, this class differences still around, certainly during the interwar years.
Yes. So when we came to the First World War,
Yes.
both Christian Cypriots and Muslim Cypriots joined the war as militaries in the British Army. And Christian Cypriots joined the British Army before Greece entered the war, and Muslim Cypriots joined against Ottoman Empire. How can we explain their situation? Why the ordinary people of Cyprus, both Christian and Muslim, joined the war together?
Well, the fundamental main reason why they joined was because it was a good wage. It was a good wage, and the British, from around 1912, 1913, we begin to see Cypriots migrating. You said we wouldn't talk about migration, but a little bit we will, because they begin to migrate, and they begin to go to North America, South America, and the honest truth is, even though I've done a little bit of work on this, there is a lot more that needs to be done, but I just don't have the files to know what numbers are we talking about. In 1914, we also see, and 1915 and into 1916, Cypriots being hired to go and go to France for good money as well. Now, obviously, Cypriots also migrate to Egypt. That's still remains a very popular destination, and there's a lot of what we might call seasonal migration there, where they go there to work for, I don't know, however many months of the year. It depends on how much work they could find. It depends on the year, if it's a good year for work, and people going back and forth. So what the British do when they're asked to form the Mule Corps, the governor, Sir John Clawson, says, well, we've got to stop migration. Otherwise, we're not going to raise anybody. Nobody's going to want to be part of this Mule Corps, no matter how much money we offer them. So that's what they do. They basically ban men of military age from leaving the country. And therefore, well, there really is only one alternative, or two alternatives. You stay in the island and you hope for the best, or you sign up. And the point to say is that, I think you know, there were about 12,000 or whatever it was that signed up. So this is the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed doing. If I can just say for a minute, the plan was to do this one first. I was meant to do this book first, but then what was going to be just one chapter in that book, and it was one chapter when I did the book eventually, but ended up turning into this book, which was a little bit of a miracle book because there was just so little information. But I found the list, the honor roll, incomplete as it was, but it was more than enough for me to be able to piece together what had as well as other sources. And the honor roll is what shows me that they signed up together, because what happened was the British set up centers where they had to go and go forward and sign up. And I should point out that many more were rejected than accepted, right? The British didn't just accept everybody, although there were instances where they accepted people and then they found out that they had some disability or whatever it might have been, and they ended up sending them back. But that was sort of rare. It wasn't that common. But these centers, you know, you had to travel in some instances very, very long way to get there. So not only did it make sense to go together for economic reasons, it made sense to them because most of these people from mixed villages, and there were many, many hundreds of mixed villages at this point in time, they were friends. They were around the same age, right? When they went together to sign up.
Yeah, of course.
Oh yes, you asked me about Greece. I forgot. Yeah, sorry. You asked me about how they enlisted and they went to Greek in the Greek army. Did you say? And also how the Cypriot Muslims fought against the Ottomans.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, let's clarify. None of these muleteers fought, right? They were auxiliaries. They were there to carry food, to carry ammunition, to carry the wounded, to carry the dead if they wanted to carry the dead if they could. They weren't there to fight. They weren't armed. So they were there to, so to speak, drive the mules, and basically that was all that they were meant to do. I mean, of course, it's quite interesting so they served in Salonika primarily, and basically what they did was the Cypriot Mule Corps wasn't sort of this unit, or basically Cypriots were taken and added to various units and whatever regiments, battalions, whatever it was. So some of them, you know, unusually though, ended up in other places like in Egypt, where there is definitely one case which I talk about in the book because he lost the leg there. But also, as you know, when you know the Salonika front ended, let's put it that way, they went to Istanbul as part of the Allied armies of occupation, you know. So, and yes, there were Muslims, Cypriot Muslims there as part of that. At that point in time, of course, the Ottoman government was cooperating with the Allies. So in that instance, it didn't seem all that, I suppose, unusual.
Mm-hmm. So this was normal for the people at that time, because we are living in a nationalist world and nationalist states, and the Christian Greeks and Muslim Turks in the same army sound interesting to many people.
Yeah.
Orthodox Greeks joined the Anglican British Army. Yes, they were both Christian, but their sects were different. And Muslim Turks joined the Christian army with Christian Greeks against Muslim Ottomans. Was it interesting at that time too, or it was normal for them?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm not sure if it was normal in a broader context, but for the people themselves, I think it was just another job. And to be working with, Cypriots working on whatever jobs, that was totally normal for them to be working together. It would have been totally normal for them to be employed, in the redevelopment of Famagusta Harbour, or in the construction of the railway, or in the construction of roads, or the reservoirs, or whatever it might have been. And I don't think that any of them would have considered this as unusual in that sense. Now, for us and for other, I suppose, at the time, Europeans, they might have, if they'd known about it, thought of the political connotations of it. But I don't think these people thought too hard about the fact that they were contributing towards the British war effort. Certainly, in my view, if they were opposed to the British war effort, if they were on the German side, they wouldn't have signed up. As we know, I did an article some years ago, which I updated for this book on British military intelligence in Cyprus. And as we know that, there were a handful of Muslims who were disloyal. I think it's fair to say, however, the majority of the population, both Christian and Muslim, were loyal to the British Empire. There's no doubt that some of the politicians were not loyal, but they weren't dangerous, if you know what I mean. There was just, chatter. It was just sort of all talk, really. The Cypriot, Greek Cypriots, they, from what I can see, there wasn't anything treacherous, I think is the word that I want to use. There might have been some, trade with the enemy, right? But the big one was when this Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot took a small vessel down to the, I think it was Adana, and basically told them everything about what the British were doing in Cyprus, where they had their bases, everything from the Cypriot Mule Corps to the fact that there was the Légion d'Orient, the Armenian Legion, up near Monarcha, near Bogazi, there, everything, spilled the whole beans. But by that point in time, I think it was later on in the war, the Ottomans were unable to capitalize on this. Sent around and they flew over these places which this guy had described to them. And this was revealed much later, interestingly, by a witness who was there. He worked for, I can't remember who it was, and he ended up in Cyprus, and he revealed this information to the British. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The other one was the article that I wrote in which I talk about Cypriots serving in the Greek armed forces. I really enjoyed doing that article. It was quite difficult to do because you're arguing against the grain, against what people believe, which is that Cypriots flocked to the Greek armed forces. Well, they really didn't. And they avoided doing so, even if they had gone and taken out Greek citizenship as well. There was an avoidance of doing that. And then there was the instances of Cypriots in Egypt and elsewhere who were suddenly and rather randomly kidnapped by the Greek authorities to go serve in the Asia Minor Anatolian campaign. It was extraordinary information. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You also mentioned Cypriots were kidnapped by the Ottomans, right?
Yes, earlier on, yes. They were mainly earlier on during the war, I think. It was a very similar sort of situation.
Some Turkish Muslim Cypriots also didn't want to enter the Ottoman army.
Yeah, most of these people who were kidnapped were just going about their lives in wherever they were, They were there working. Some had, many of them had families, and then suddenly they're taken off to the front. It's like, well, no, I'm just an ordinary person living here, and I'm not connected to this war. Basically, is what they were trying to put across, but it didn't work. And these are the cases that we know of only because they were able to get to a British consul, right? I can't even imagine how many others there were. Obviously, there were Cypriots who willingly volunteered and went and fought. We know that there was a small amount that went and fought in the Balkan Wars as well. But yes, the numbers are really, by comparison to how many went to serve in the British forces, they're quite small. But on the other hand, we also need to consider that they're actually fighting in the Greek armed forces. They were not auxiliaries, whereas in the British armed forces, they were auxiliaries. And in the advertising for recruitment, the British tried to make it very clear that they would not be in harm's way, which, if an educated person were to see that, they would, they would think twice about whether that could be possible. There were many who died. Many of the Cypriot muleteers did die. But yes, basically, we need to understand that distinction. But yes, there wouldn't have been a great many Cypriots who served in the Asia Minor War who went from Cyprus deliberately to serve, partly because the British didn't allow it.
Okay, so it's complicated.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned briefly the loyalty of the Cypriots. Can you explain this? Because you divided the islanders into upper class, middle class, and lower classes in your book. Can you elaborate on the relations of Christian and Muslim Cypriots of different classes with the British administration?
Yeah. Well, going back to the early days of the British occupation, the class distinctions are, of course, more larger, more evident. We see very clearly, even during Ottoman times, Christian and Muslim peasants uniting together against the administration. We occasionally see this in the early years of the British period as well. But as we get to World War I, we begin to see this breaking down a little bit. Yet there are still, the population primarily are peasants. And Surridge's report is one source that we have that shows us this, but there's of course many others. And of course we see the middle and upper middle classes. Their world basically revolves around either trade, sometimes both trade and politics, and their politics during this period is somewhat disconnected from the peasantry, because it really revolves around either supporting enosis, either in a sort of fanatical way, or in a more moderate way, or in the Muslim case, it's to oppose it. And you sometimes get people saying, oh well, no, look, the Turkish Cypriots, they weren't opposed. They even signed on during the referendum, after the Second World War. Well, we have all of the evidence dating back at least till before the First World War of opposition to enosis from Turkish Cypriots, and indeed from minorities, from the smaller minorities, Maronites Latin Christians and Armenians, particularly during the interwar period. So I think that the class distinctions are still there, and I think that the nationalism, although it has evolved, it hasn't totally sort of penetrated the entire population, and that there are still people whose primary identification is a religious one during the interwar period.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one last question. So we talk about many things about nationalism. It's spreading in the island. How do you think it's spread across the island? Do you think any other alternative possibilities? Do you think any other alternative was possible? I mean, did the Greek-speaking Christian people have to be Greek and the Turkish-speaking Muslim people to be Turkish? Was it inevitable for them?
But I think in history, nothing's really inevitable. The spread of nationalism didn't happen overnight, nor did it happen in a week or a month or a year. It happened over a series of decades and perhaps several generations, as it spread during World War II and after World War II. So it was certainly a very slow process. Now, could there have been an alternative? It's hard to say. That's a hypothetical. Thinking about the last book that I did, which is this one. I went in for some hypothetical in this one, in which I hypothesized that, for instance, and I'll come back to your question, but I hypothesized, for instance, that, so the book is about the assassination of Antonios Triantafylidis in January of 1934. And basically, he was assassinated because he believed that the only way to achieve enosis was through cooperation with the British. Maybe that goes back to the Sophronius, line. However, the fanatics were totally opposed to anything other than enosis, and by this point in time, the idea of independence had also come up. It had in fact come up as early as 1912, at least that I can see, possibly even earlier. So for them, independence was totally anathema, was no. And they believed that anything other than enosis risked bringing potentially independence. However, if let's say Triantafylidis had not been assassinated, and he had succeeded in redeveloping, so to speak, relations with the British and cultivating along the lines of what we might call the Malta strategy, could it have worked in a different way? Could we have seen Cyprus become independent without having to have gone through a very traumatic and violent period from April of 1955? Maybe. And maybe if that had occurred, that the Cypriots, like the Maltese, might have, so to speak, abandoned their, in the Maltese case, pro-Italian identity. Obviously, it's a little more complicated in Cyprus with the two religious groups, but it's a hypothetical. But you never know. It might have happened. I mean, there are many people now who believe that they are just Cypriots, and it doesn't matter what their religion is, or what the religion of their parents is, or what their language is. So I don't know. The answer is I really don't know, but maybe.
Okay. Thank you very much again. It's almost 1 hour and it's
Yes,
time to
my pleasure.
pass the Q&A session. This was such an interesting conversation to me. I enjoyed a lot and I hope it was the same for you and the audience. Now you can ask the audience, you can ask their questions to the Professor Varnava. You can raise your hands or just write them the message box and I can read. So, Alyosha.
Great. Thank you, Professor Varnava. That was great. So you talked a lot, I think very rightly. You said that even up until the 1920s, about 80% of people were at or below subsistence level. They were mostly illiterate. And you painted a picture of separation between like middle-class realm of politics and ordinary people who are concerned primarily with the living wage, whose motivations are therefore pragmatic, whether it's joining the Mule Corps or supporting certain political movements. They're really concerned with managing a livelihood for themselves and their families. So as a consequence of that, I think if I heard you right, you were also suggesting that nationalism is a primarily middle class, and this tracks with a lot of historians' ideas that nationalism is essentially phenomenon of literate people who get educated, maybe go to Greece or go to Germany or something, learn of this movement, and then spread it through the population. I wanted to ask if if maybe you could share your thoughts on whether nationalism should be identified just as kind of a phenomenon of middle class politics that's separate from some other activity of the working class, or if there might be some more organic, let's say, connection with the working class. So I guess a different way of asking this is, as a historian looking at the history of Cyprus up until the 60s, as the last question indicated, we could tell the story of politics and nationalism as something imposed from above on a population that itself is not really thinking that much about politics. Personally, I feel like that might leave out some, or might not fully account for the kinds of politics that we see. So yeah, if you can just respond to that.
Yes. Well, I agree entirely with what you say. It does leave out, particularly if we think about how many people from the peasant classes around the time of the First World War, and indeed after, aspire to no longer be part of the peasant class, and therefore make steps, let's say, in their lives to work in a different area, so to speak. Some of them migrate, and that's part of this. Others migrate internally, and internal migration in Cyprus had been happening under the British, but especially happens when the redevelopment of Famagusta Harbour happens, when the railroad is built, and so forth and so on. And that's when we begin to see, for example, the growth with the population in Varosi, and so we do begin to see people of the peasant class moving they're socially mobile to some extent, entering, let's say, the sort of more lower middle class, and inevitably coming into contact with those who are more politically involved, and that transfers to them at some stage in this relationship. So I think this is beginning to happen by World War I, and then after World War I, with things like the Russian Revolution, as well as the rise of fascism. By the 30s, we're beginning to see peasants who have already moved into become socially mobile, They are now also, identifying more and more as Greeks or as Turks, whether they're right wing or whether they're left wing. Now, I know that the Communist Party of Cyprus, with the very unfortunate KKK acronym, was in favor of independence for Cyprus within a Balkan federation. But by the late, actually, I think it's earlier, but let's just say here, by the late 30s, there are many left-wing Cypriots who are more in favor of NOCs than independence. And that's where we get, I think that's where we get Agel during the Second World War. So, yeah, I would agree with what you just said. However, again, this is, I would say, a smaller proportion of the population than the majority. That's why by in 29 or whenever Surridge has done that report, he's saying that 80% are on the subsistence line or below it. It would have been more. It would have been higher 15 years earlier.
Great. So just to follow up, so insofar as nationalism becomes a popular movement, so at some point it does gain support beyond just the middle class, it's a byproduct of social mobility in your view. Thank you. I think that answers it.
Thank you. And Alexia.
Yes, hi. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm not sure about my connection. Yeah, great. Thanks for a very, very interesting talk. My question is a bit similar to the one that's in the chat right now. So there's this historical classification of Greek Christians versus Turkish Muslims that continues to this day. But I was wondering about the people who did not fit these rigid categories. How were they represented in all of this? Or were they represented at all? And also the second question would be, how was the colonial administration's stance towards them?
Do you mean minority groups?
Minority groups, and also I don't know if it's possible to be Greek and Muslim as opposed to Greek Christian, and also yes, any other minority groups as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, absolutely, all of that applies. I mean, obviously there are small groups of Maronite Christians, Latin Catholic Christians, who are descendants of various Western European and indeed Levantine communities, whether they're French or Italian, going back, Maltese as well. And then, of course, there are many so-called, as they were called, Linobambagi, Linen Cottons, people who were to the outside world Muslims and privately Christians. I think not a great deal of work has been done on this, but my feeling is that from the work that has been done and from my assessment, that it's quite more complicated than that, and there is a lot of crossover between their religious practices, and in many instances they developed sort of their own identity, not simply saying, to the outside world they were Muslims and privately they were Christians. It doesn't quite work that way. From the British point of view, one of the things that the British wanted as soon as they got there was a census, and the reason why they wanted a census is because they wanted taxes, right? However, those census reports contain, from 1881 and roughly 10 years every 10 years thereafter, although of course it's interrupted during World War II and delayed until 46. But those census reports count, the population, and you can find some unusual things there, things like Muslims who speak Greek, Christians who speak primarily Turkish, and so forth and so on. You know, these combinations. In terms of how the British, I think you asked how the British responded to them or how they included them. I mean, when the British established the Legislative Council in 1882, they distinctly did not refer to, well, they gave, first of all, they gave the locals, the Cypriots, a majority in the legislature, which was quite ahead of its time, actually. And they didn't say, you know, there will be so many Greeks and so many Turks, or so many Greek Christians and so many Turkish Muslims. It was specifically along religious lines, Christians and Muslims. They referred to it in the old style, Mohammedan. And, you know, to the extent that in the interwar period, when the Greek Cypriot nationalists boycotted the elections in early 20s, I can't remember the exact year, a group, you know, I think it was two Maronites put their names forward, and this ended up upsetting the Greek nationalists who wanted to have it both ways. You know, they didn't want to run, but then didn't want anybody else to run either. But I think that from the British point of view, they respected the minorities in the sense that they respected their positions, particularly on Enosis, and how they genuinely believed that it could potentially threaten their existence in Cyprus, and if not their existence, their economic interests.
This is super interesting. Thanks. Would you happen to? I was wondering if you have where I can read more about this census writing.
The census.
Who has? Yeah, if there are any.
Well, I've written about the census reports in you know not in all my books, in the 3 books that I did, the 3 main books. This is just really a booklet, really. But anyway, in the other books, they all have introductions where I talk about the census, because I find the census very important. Even though it's not accurate, it's as accurate as what we're going to get. That's all we've basically pretty much got, and we can, you know, cross-reference it with other sources. But, you know, we can see there, you know, in more recent times, as I've started, you know, working on migration, I can see, you know, how many, for example, white Russians were in Cyprus, right? Or how many people were not born in Cyprus who belong to the Greek Cypriot community or whatever, you know, or how many people were born here or there. So, you know, the census reports some of them are available online. You can find them, particularly the older ones, I think. But yeah, my books give an analysis of them.
Perfect, thank you.
There is also a similar question in chat box by Christos Nicola. Do we have any sources on the status positions of the island's religious minorities towards the British administration, or if they also had shifts in their identities due to the growth of the middle classes on the island?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. So when I worked on the minorities, it was quite a long time ago, back when I was living in Cyprus, and we organized the Minorities of Cyprus conference. And I would argue that not a great deal of historical work has been done since then on the minorities. And indeed, what we did was just a very, how can I put it, really, it was a first step. I've forgotten the question, sorry, about the...
Let me read again.
Yes.
Do we have any sources on the stances, positions of the island's religious minorities towards the British administration, or if they also had shifts in their identities due to the growth of the middle classes on the island?
Well, their position on the British was that they wanted the British to stay. Their position was, you know, we are a minority and the British are our best bet of protecting us. Now, whether that was because they feared for their existence and their identities if Cyprus joined Greece, or whether it was because for economic reasons they believed that the British were a far better prospect than a poor, very poor Greece, particularly during the interwar period, and you know, an unstable Greece as well. So they were very firm about being opposed to Enosis, absolutely. Now, as for their identity, that's a harder one. That's a very hard one to answer. But the best way to answer it is that I think that these groups are able to remain distinct primarily because of their religious affiliation. However, it becomes very hard as small, because they are small, and particularly because there is an element of intermarriage occurring. And inevitably, when you're intermarrying into a much larger community in a place like Cyprus, you end up to some extent being consumed by that larger identity, which is everywhere, is around you, right? So I think that it's basically, that's how I would answer that.
Okay, thank you. And Zelia. You are mute. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Actually, I have two questions. Yasu.
Yasu, how are
Andrea,
you?
how are you?
Are you well?
I'm not a historian. I do theory and philosophy and come from a decolonial perspective. So my first question is about the discussion of, the following up of Gachaounis, the important, and I also consider very important that the different genealogy he does of the, when the British first came to the island, and he debunks, he deconstructs that myth, okay? But on the other hand, one might say that at the level of narrative, what he doesn't do it, but embracing the other narrative might also have the power of a myth. That the British came and everybody wanted them because they believed in the rule of law. So the way I approach Gachaounis' intervention in the archive is to observe that nationalism was, and Cypriot Greek nationalism was actually stronger in the diaspora, for example, the diaspora in Egypt than in Cyprus. And I find it interesting how nationalist ideology can be re-imported from the margins. In a similar way, there is this myth that the British tried to Anglicize the education, which is a myth. They never tried to Anglicize education, and but at the same time, I have a letter from the Archbishop writing somewhere at the turn of the century, saying that, complaining why the British have fired the Anglo-didaskalos. The teacher was teaching English at Pankiprio Gymnasio. This also, though, doesn't mean that the English and the teaching of English didn't have an imperial power in Cyprus, particularly with regards to the blackmailing of the people working in the civil service, who were expected within 2 months of English to pass the exam. Otherwise, they would be fired. So that English had a power as a discourse. My other question is about the use of the term ordinary Cypriots. I understand the power of the term, but I think it misses some of the agonistic power of the term subaltern.
Yes.
For example, because the term ordinary Cypriots is not ideologically neutral. It had already been used by the British to refer to the good Cypriots, the natives, the ones who are not, who don't have the disease of enosis. That is the people who are apolitical, but the ordinary people had also subaltern sides and interventions. For example, it's very interesting how in the 30s, the youth became securitized with all those laws that were introduced about juvenile delinquency, and ordinary youth who were committing ordinary crimes, such as stealing lemons or riding a bicycle in the evening, ended up in the prison of Lambusa, which was actually a prison. So these are my questions.
Yeah. So your first question was about the Gachaunis and the transfer from Egypt of the nationalism.
More of the observation. My question is whether whether giving too much emphasis also to the real speech of Sophronios might also be building another kind of myth.
Might be building another kind of myth.
The myth that, to be more raw, that that the British were welcomed and the British were good because they were bringing the rule of law.
Yeah. Well, yes and no, because the British disappointed them, and it didn't take very long for them to disappoint them. However, just like when Cyprus was occupied, and it was the talk of the town in the UK, particularly in London, you know, that it was going to be this and it was going to be that and it was going to be fantastic. You know, when the British arrived.
What they refer to as the white elephant.
But yeah, in the sense that it was, but, you know, very quickly they realized that it was a, so to speak, a dud. However, there's a similar thing happening the other way around, and that is that when the, you know, the expectations of the Cypriots are to some extent unmet by the British arrival. It is met from one perspective of the judiciary does get sorted out. Although when priests are arrested, they're not happy about that. So that's an interesting one. However, from an economic point of view, they're not particularly satisfied. They expected more from the British. But I think that comes from, in part, a misunderstanding of the differences between the UK and the difference with its empire. The empire was there to, in large part, serve the imperial center, and it was, you know, not intended for it to itself, for instance, become industrialized, right? It was there for raw materials and to facilitate trade and to protect the empire as well. So it's not so much that there is a myth being created that's or a second myth being created. It's, I suppose, the context that, I mean, Sophronius himself is perhaps a little more old than new. However, he is eventually rather disillusioned by the British. And I think that in part, this also helps, particularly after his death, the nationalists, and also helps explain why the supporters of Sophronius have pretty much abandoned his line, because they are now supporting Enosis. Even if they are more moderate than the others, they are still giving much greater emphasis than certainly Sophronius did. And your point about Anglicization is a very important one. In my first book, I talk about how the High Commissioner, can't remember the year, but it's early on, it's Sir Robert Biddulph, and and he wants to introduce English in the schools alongside the alongside the local languages. He doesn't want to replace them. He wants to introduce it alongside the languages. And it's rejected back in London by the Liberal government because they argue that, well, Greek is a European language and you know, they don't need to learn English in order to become intelligent. So I think that was a substantial turning point and not something that was, it was revisited a few times later on, and they did teach English in some schools, of course, but it wasn't the same thing as what they were proposing at that moment. And your second question?
If I just make comment on that.
Yes.
They didn't introduce English. They didn't introduce the teaching of English, but they introduced a fear to the power of English, or they introduced a fear to the lack of English.
Yeah.
So what during the later years, even after the independence, came to be known as κυβερνητικές εξετάσεις, the government exam. Like if you pass this exam, then you have been saved. You'll have a job.
Yeah.
Actually, the first government exam took place in 1900s. The first fall, and it was introduced not as a language certification. It was introduced as a ritual of passage. You have to obey, you have to suffer, and then you are you become one of our subjects. And I think this imperialist approach to language, which is other than the English language, has in a way become coextensive to the teaching of language later on in Cyprus.
Yeah. And it also connects actually in the 30s to migration, when they introduce restrictions at the port of departure. In other words, in Cyprus, they introduce restrictions, and you have to have this, you have to have that, and then one of the other things you have to have is a basic understanding and the ability to speak basic English before you can migrate. Not so much for the women, because at some point in the late 30s, the British basically say, we want more Cypriot women to come here because the Cypriot men here are taking our women. So, you know, that discourse. However, for men, it becomes something that's necessary for them to have at least a basic level of English.
Have you written about this? Have you written about this?
Yes,
that it was required?
Yes.
Is this from the Australian archives in Melbourne or from?
No, but the Australians also require it later on. It's in the article in English Historical Review. I'm pretty sure we talk about it there. And there's several other pieces that I've done since then, which has added to it, because I later discovered some other files as well.
This is very crucial. Intervention in the archive. Thank you.
Yeah, language becomes very important for the ability to migrate. And I mean, but this isn't unusual to Cyprus. The Maltese, they can't migrate unless basically they have a knowledge of, because they're primarily wanting to go to Australia, and they can't go unless their immigration department back in Valletta ensures that their English is up to scratch. So it's happening not just in the Cypriot context. Have I answered? I can't remember your second question.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't want to take over, just to share with you this anecdotal little thing.
Yes.
My mother, her brothers migrated to Australia, both in the 30s. And she was the youngest of the family. So she remembered when she went to school and they started teaching them lessons in English. And then she's playing with my child, for example. She starts saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and then she doesn't know the next. And then she starts, oh, damn them. And I say, I mean, τους καταραμένους. And I'm saying, who, mom? Who were the bad ones? He said, and they were teaching us English, and those older boys in the village, they were parading for EOGA, and they destroyed our English books, and they also broke the marks that they gave us for
Yes.
the celebration of the Queen's birthday, and she says that's the only mug ever anyone gave me in my life.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Zelia, for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work. It's precious.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much. We have another question from unnamed Zoom user. You are mute. Do you want to ask the question, or maybe she or he mistakenly raised his or her hand? I think we don't have any question. Yes, right. So
could I follow up on something Zelia just said, if we have like a couple minutes?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
One of the things I took from, I don't know if this was the question that you wanted to ask Zelia, but was earlier when we talked about the myth, we talked about the myth of welcoming the British. That might be problematic. So there's a myth of desiring enosis. And I understand that your work works against that, right? And we talked about, okay.
No.
Hold on.
Okay.
No, hold on. That's not my point. So one problematic myth that we could advance would be being in favor of the British doing it. Another myth we could advance, this relates to my earlier question, is that the ordinary people don't have a position on enosis. So might not. So you can say, oh, look, the ordinary people want enosis. That's the problematic nationalist myth that kind of conscripts the people into a political narrative. And then there's another myth saying, oh, maybe they welcome the British because of modernization. There was a pragmatic view in front of it. And then there's another myth that we could advance, that the ordinary people don't have a political view. I don't know if maybe just say one more thing about it. For me, I think there's a truth to that, and that's, I think it's really important to highlight that the ordinary people are not automatically politically mobilized in service of something like enosis. But I thought Zelia, or I don't know, what I heard or what I thought of when she was talking was that, okay, but we shouldn't then go and say that, oh, ordinary people are just ordinary, don't have politics. So when Zelia said, oh, look, the subaltern are more agonistic, for me, that's meant to highlight the fact that just because you don't have an opinion on enosis doesn't mean you don't have a politics at all. Like, they're not just an ordinary people that can be mobilized for the purposes of, some bourgeois politics or whatever. There is some thoughtful politics there at all. So I guess, yeah, just maybe if you have any thoughts on that, like, for me, that's just what I took away from Zelia.
I mean, it's very difficult to know what the peasant population, what the rural laboring population, the majority of the people, felt and believed during either the early years or even later. And the other thing to say is, going back to something Zelia said about subaltern, I mean, there is a significant power dimension here, right? So, for instance, during World War I, when we see people writing to the government and saying, my son served in your glorious armies for, liberty and so forth and so on. I sat back and thought, this is rather elevated language from some guy from some obscure village, or maybe not from an obscure village. It doesn't really matter. But, to what extent is this a reflection of their view that they are so much lower than the British? Do you know what I mean? In this power dynamic, that they need to elevate and exaggerate their language, or are do they genuinely believe in this? I mean, in some instances, I wondered. So even going back to the late 1880s, this is something that there's a couple of things from this period that I want to revisit one day. And one of them is the famine in the Karpas Peninsula. And the other one is the Legislative Council elections, can't remember the year, 1887 maybe, in which a district commissioner, whose name was, I think his name was Young, but I've forgotten his first name, decided to run.
He was the commissioner of Paphos.
No, Famagusta.
Before he went to Paphos, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, he was, you know, they moved around, and he was, at the time, he was the district commissioner of Famagusta. And he ran to be elected in the legislature, and he missed out. And he appealed this, claiming that those who had won had bribed their way to victory. And there was a court case, and I can't even remember what happened. However, what I do remember is that local people from Famagusta district were brought in and testified to say that, yes, they were bribed, and yes, they wanted to vote for Young, but they didn't, and whatever, and so forth and so on. You know, it's a very tricky one in that case. You know, if they swore an oath, it's hard to argue that there, you know, that the power dynamic might have influenced them to testify in such a way in favor of the British, but it still may have. You know, I don't know. I need to revisit that. It's a huge, huge file, if my memory serves me right, which I never properly studied closely enough. But it's a very interesting one.
Could I say one thing? Because earlier you said also something along similar lines, I think. You said, when you were talking about nationalism and the peasants, you said something along the lines of them being non-nationalists, but they had religious identities. So religious identities preceding that. And the question of religion and politics, as you're describing it, and especially in this voting, is a question of like genuine or sincere belief. So you might have this, you know, the power that distorts some genuine belief in being Christian or Muslim, or being pro this candidate or pro another candidate. And I guess my point would just be that I think this is a broadly shared point, but searching for that genuine, sincere, like core belief that's masked by distorted by power dynamics might be a, you know, it might be a red herring. It might be there's no genuineness there. But the question remains. But then we shouldn't. So then, as a historian, do you just write the story of the what appears as a, you know, whether it's distorted practices or politics or whatever? Yeah. What can you account for if there's no genuine there? Which is all to say, I share the problem.
I mean, the critical thing is that, I mean, first thing to say is, if I were to write this book now for this period, I wouldn't be writing it the same way. I'd be writing it in a different way. And you know, because I've been quite influenced by the muleteers book, and you know, then I went back and finished the other book because I said I was going to write it, so I went back and wrote it. But I feel that I wrote it in a sort of very similar way to how I wrote the first book, right? And then I went off and did this little one, which opened up, again, my eyes in a different way to actually really thoroughly reading against the grain, these archival sources, even more thoroughly perhaps than I had in the past, to the point where I make this argument that, you know, the people that were probably behind the assassination are the ones writing in the newspapers in Greece saying that it was not an assassination, and it was a murder for personal reasons and so forth. And I'm arguing, well, it's quite likely that they want to present that rather than that's the, you know, that being the truth, because they probably were behind it. So yeah.
We have one more question in the chat box from Christos Nikolaou. Do we know what the relationship of Serafinos with his Muslim counterparts in the Legislative Council was?
Did he say Sophronius?
Yes, Sophronius.
Sophronius never sat in the Legislative Council. He never sat in the Legislative Council. He considered it beneath him, I believe. This is my, I don't have any documents to prove what I'm saying now, by the way. But I think he considered it beneath him because he wanted the British to co-opt the church. He didn't want the church to have to go to the Legislative Council. Others did. Other bishops, yes, they did. The nationalist ones particularly, they went there. They wanted to be elected, but not Sophronius. Sophronius, again, this is, you know, more of the old, you know, I suppose a bit of the old in him that, you know, as ethnarch, he didn't want to put his name forward and run a campaign and so forth and so on to be elected when he already has, in his view at least, the ear of the High Commissioner. However, if going to the substance of your question about his relationships with his counterparts, the relationship that he had with his counterparts was actually really good, going back not just to Ottoman times, but also to particularly the early British period, but also even later on in the mid sort of to late 1890s. I'm just trying to think. There was a High Commissioner called Walter Sendel. And I distinctly remember a file in which both, I'm pretty sure it's Sophronius, and the Mufti, I think, sign, as well as many other signatures from both Christians and Muslims, asking London to keep him on, to extend his time as High Commissioner. My view of Sophronius is that he did not favor enosis, unless, as I said, the British left, because he did feel that it could have caused problems between the two communities. Just based upon the way he talks about being a Cypriot and Cyprus, and how it's really fundamentally a religious identity and a very space-driven, I suppose, identity, you know, the place that he called his homeland.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we don't have any question. Thank you very much for this stimulating presentation. It was wonderful for me. And thank you very much for the audience, you attending this webinar and supporting Bahçes. And for the closure, Loidos, would you like to take over?
Sure, just a couple of quick announcements before we go. One thing is our episodes are uploaded on our YouTube channel, usually within the week, but we are experiencing a backlog right now. So subscribe to our social media or YouTube, and you'll be notified as soon as this episode goes up if you want to tell your friends and family. The second thing is we keep the conversation going on our blog. So if you would like to contribute by writing a short reflection piece, maybe you were inspired, maybe you were really happy about this, maybe you were angry, maybe something came up that made you want to look into it a little bit more, tell us about it on our blog. You can access our blog on our website. I'm sending the link in the chat right now, or talk to one of us on our social media. The final thing is, if you've enjoyed this webinar, this episode of the Bαhçές Histories of Cyprus, and would like to come back next month, our next guest will be ethnomusicologist Nicoleta Dimitriou, talking about her new book on the Cypriot fiddler. That'll be in February. We will announce the date on our social media. So Andrekos, thank you so much. Nur, thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for joining us today. We'll see you all next month.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.